What's up everyone, it's Austin here from Make Pop Music and Austin Hall Audio, and today we are back with another video. And for the video today, I wanted to go over something that we get some questions on, and that is how to mix 808s. So in the video today, I'm going to go over how to pick the right 808 style sound for your production or the song at hand. And then we're going to go over how to mix that with things like EQ, saturation, harmonic distortion, sidechaining. So you can make sure that you can get that 808 sitting in your mix nice. It's audible. It adds a lot of, oomph and vibe. However, it's not taking over the balance. It's not making the whole mix muddy or boomy or taking up way too much headroom. So we're going to dive into all of those little tips and tricks. And for the intents and purposes of this video, I will be referring to an 808 as any kind of like long decaying sub bass. I know an 808 is traditionally like the Roland 808 drum machine. However, I just wanted to make that clarification for anybody watching. This is going to be going over the kind of modern understanding of an 808. So we're going to be taking a look at that. And then if you have any questions, let us know in the comments down below. Before we hop in, if you like this video, please make sure you like, comment, and subscribe. It helps us out a ton. And if you want to support the channel, you can head over to makepopmusic.com and check out everything that we have over there. But without further ado, let's actually hop into Cubase so I can show you how to pick the right 808 and then how to mix the right 808 for your productions. Let's check it out. Now we're in the session. The first thing I want to do is just talk about picking the right 808. So I know this video is about mixing 808s, and this kind of just falls into the category of production, but this is such a crucial step. So even if you're mixing a project and the 808 is just not fitting right, you might want to go back to the producer and ask if you can get an alternate 808 sample. So we're going to be looking at 3 different kind of ideas. So we're going to look at like a clean 808, a dirty 808, and then kind of like this really weird, gnarly 808. And I tend to prefer to kind of make mine throughout Serum. I know a lot of people will kind of drag and drop different 808s that they get from sample packs or splices into kind of like a sampler. But all of the mixing techniques will kind of be the same. So the first 808 that we'll take a look at is a clean 808. This kind of comes in handy if you have a kind of cleaner, softer, poppier mix. So like I would use this in something like maybe like a ballad that just has like one big 808 hit to kind of give some low end. It's not really going to sit super well in this kind of built up hip hop production, but just so you can kind of hear what it sounds like with no mixing or anything, here is a clean 808. So you can hear that there's not much saturation, there's not any kind of weird harmonic distortion. It's pretty simple. It's a pretty normal like 1.5 second sine wave 808. So nothing insane. And that's kind of an option that you can use if you want something that you can kind of feel, but you can't really hear. It'll be hard to hear on small speakers, but it can provide a nice bit of low end without becoming kind of a focal element. So that would be when I would use a clean 808. And then we have something like a dirty 808, which is kind of built super similar. However, typically what I'll do is I'll use something that has a little bit of harmonics in it. So I'll use like a seconds wavetable instead of just like a pure sine wave. And then sometimes I'll even use something that's got some top end and I'll filter it with something like that and then run it through some distortion and Serum. And then this is what that sounds like. And so if you have an 808 sample that kind of has a lot of that distortion, a lot of that harmonic saturation, and a lot of that kind of oomph and compression just kind of naturally built in, you're going to want to mix that much differently than these clean 808s that we showed earlier. So here's what this one sounds like in the mix with no additional mixing or processing. And you can tell immediately it has a totally different vibe to this. And then the last thing that we'll go over is something like a gnarly 808. You'll hear this a lot in like Travis Scott stuff, Don Toliver stuff, anything that's going to have kind of like almost a squelchy 808. And this was just done with the Not Classy preset out of Poptopia from our website. And you can see that we've got some hyper built in, we've got some distortion, we've got some filtering, and it sounds like this. We've actually got this envelope that's causing a little cutoff variation. So this is a super non-traditional 808 and will need to kind of be mixed differently than the dirty 808 or the clean 808. But it does provide a nice little bit of variation because we have some top-end content that is not just going to come from saturation or distortion. It's kind of actually baked into the sample or the preset that you're using. And that sounds like this in the mix. So this is just a quick little example and demonstration on how picking different 808 samples or presets or loops or files or anything like that is going to have a dramatically different effect on how they fit and sit into a mix, which will have a totally different effect on how they are mixed into a song. So now that we have those, I'll go over some of my mixing strategies and we'll kind of cycle through the different versions of the 808 so I can show you, if you were using a clean 808, here's what I do. If you were using a dirty 808, here's what I do. So on and so forth. So let's go ahead and let's take a look at this clean one. So the first thing I want to talk about is EQing your 808s. So we're going to go ahead and look at this dirty 808 first, because this has a lot of the saturation and harmonic distortion and stuff that we'll talk about in a minute that will apply to a clean 808. But if you have something like this where a lot of the texture is like baked into the sample or the preset, here's what it sounds like. One thing that I like to do with 808s that kind of have this much body and this much character and kind of sit this evenly across an EQ spectrum is take out some of these mids, because a lot of these like mids and low mids right here in the like 140 to 180 region and then the kind of 300 to 500 region up here start to really sit on your mix. And this is a lot of the time when I find people are not having, quote unquote tight low end. It's because their low end is shifting way too much up into the mids, and it's starting to sit where their synths are sitting, their vocals are sitting, their snare drums are sitting. So if you have an 808 that has this much character and this much body already, you're going to want to sacrifice some of these little areas, and I'll kind of show you in solo with the drums. So that's that area that we were getting that really cool harmonic difference from adding the second wavetable, but it starts to kind of poke on the mix a little bit. And that like kind of 260, 270 region just has that really woo, and on a small speaker, that's going to start to overwhelm an entire mix. So this is kind of the area that I really like my synths and my vocals to sit rather than my low end, because for low end, this just becomes super like what I would call woofy or boxy, and it just doesn't really sound that great in a mix. So a lot of the time on 808s, you're really going to want to tame some of this, because let me show you what this sounds like with and without. Here is without. You can feel that it kind of sits way on top of the mix and would kind of get in the way of some of the other elements. Now, if we engage this EQ, you'll feel that it kind of scoops that out. The 808 is still felt and heard equally. However, you're not going to have a tough time sitting vocals in or extra synths in or any other arrangement elements. Check this out. You've still got that top end that's going to come through on a small speaker. You've still got that low end that's going to bump a sub. However, you're not having to deal with all this really, really nasty low mid and mid area that's just going to start taking up a bunch of extra room. Another thing that I see a lot of people do, I have a lot of peers and friends that will do this, is start to like filter out some of the low end. So they'll do like a 18 dB cut at like 20 hertz. You see this a lot in electronic music. I'm not a huge fan of it. I don't mind my low end shifting down there. But if you're finding that your 808 or your bass or anything like that is feeding into a limiter just way too hard, you can start to filter some of this out. That way it'll get rid of some of that energy and give you a little bit more headroom. So there's not much that you can hear down here. If you're not on headphones or a sub, you won't hear anything. And a lot of the reason that people do get rid of some of this down here is because if you're not on a crazy sub or in a club or something, you'll never hear or feel that whatsoever. However, it can really, really start to mess up how a limiter is working on your entire mix. So here's what this 808 sounds like with no EQ and then with some EQ engaged. You can see that it's just kind of clearing that up, and that's something that I like to do, especially with an 808 that's kind of got a lot already happening in the sample or in the preset. So let's go ahead and talk about step number 2, and that is adding some extra distortion or saturation to make that 808 just knock a little bit more. We don't really need to do it on this dirty 808 because it kind of has that already built in. As you can see, this has some distortion that's being fed really, really heavily. So we don't really need it on that one. What we'll do instead is we'll take a look at this clean 808 and I'll kind of show you how I would mix that. So here's how it's sitting with the kick. It's not really doing anything super special right now. It It's just kind of whatever. What I like to do with an 808 like this that might be a little bit too clean is just add a little bit of saturation, so on smaller speakers it starts to poke out, it starts to actually have room in the mix and not just be an element for like feeling low end. If you want your 808 to be heard whatsoever, you're going to want to add something like this. So one thing that I'll do a lot of the time is I'll add something like Decapitator. I like it on the end setting. Here's some kind of settings that I kind of regularly go to. Kind of a darker tone, drive it like 6, mix it like 40-50%, and then I'll just like make sure it doesn't have too much of that low end saturating like crazy. And then you'll get something like this. It's subtle, but it really, really works in a mix. You can hear it's kind of giving it a little bit of crunch, a little bit of saturation, a little bit of mid-range, and that is what's going to help that kind of start to poke out of a mix. So if we listen in the context of a mix, just makes like a small difference that you will definitely hear on some systems. However, this is subtle, so it's not completely changing the sound of the 808 like how much distortion we have going on in that dirty example that we showed you earlier. Another plugin that I really like to use on 808s lately is the Knock plugin by Decap. If you watch this YouTube channel, you've probably seen Decap on YouTube. You've probably seen his samples on Splice. He's an incredible producer, and he has this preset that I think was actually probably made for like kick drums and snare drums. However, I've been adding it to 808s, and I'm having a really, really good time with the saturate knob, the air knob, and the clip knob. And so what this does is this is kind of like a multi-effects unit that can add some punch with things like transient manipulation and compression. It'll add some saturation. You've got a couple different models here. You can add some sub, so if you want to add some oomph to like a kick drum, we're not going to use that. Add some air to kind of give it some top end, and then add some clipping. What clipping is doing is it's basically kind of chopping off the top end, so it's kind of similar to limiting, but instead of pushing it down, it's just chopping it off. So you'll get this almost like saturated, clipped vibe that sounds really, really, really nice on kick drums and 808s. So here's what this sounds like with and without that. Here's without. You can hear as soon as I engage it, it starts to have a lot more beef and body, especially on those low notes. So adding something like some kind of distortion to an 808 is a super, super, super good way to make sure that you're going to be able to hear on different speaker settings. And you can even go super gnarly and crazy with this and do something like this. I'm going to turn it down a little bit. Just be careful, because as you start adding distortion and saturation and clipping and stuff like that, you are going to start to have less low end because it's raising that top end so much. So it's kind of changing that spectral balance. So you may want to start boosting top end or bottom end with something like EQ, or you can do what we're going to talk about in step number 4, and that is adding subharmonic content. So if you have an 808 that has the saturation, it's kind of sitting really well already. It has kind of all of the stuff that you're really liking. However, it's just not quite sitting in the perfect region for the low end. What I like to do is I like to use something like R-Bass or Max Bass or Voice of God, some kind of harmonic saturator where instead of saturating the entire thing, you're really just kind of boosting some of this low end and adding some different harmonics. So it'll kind of start to change where that low end sits. So if you have an 808 like this is actually written in a key that kind of lends itself to 808s, but let's go ahead and let's listen to this kind of gnarly 808 right here. And as you can hear, it has so much top end that we start to kind of have this hole in the low end. And so what I'll do for something like that is use something like R-Bass. And right now I've got it just kind of boosting around like the 60s, and this is kind of your intensity knob. We'll just kind of play around with settings and I'll adjust the gain. You just want to make sure you're not clipping this if that's not a sound you're going for. essentially, if we put this in the kind of 90 region, what it's going to do is it's going to fill out some of that low end that is not necessarily like low mids, but it's also not subby low end. It's kind of that low end that's going to feel good on any kind of like car speaker or kind of smaller speaker that's got a dedicated low end driver. And that kind of 80 to 110 region can be really nice for adding consistency to your low end. So what we do here is just by adding it in with something like our bass, we're kind of shifting that to being just sub to kind of taking up more of that full low end spectrum. And I know we've got a volume adjustment, so I'm not clipping this, but you'll see that even in the EQ right here, let's look at the EQ on Cubase. If we don't have that engaged, look at the kind of hole that this is leaving between like 80 and 120. And if we add this R bass, yeah, it gets a little bit quieter, but we'll kind of see how this levels out in the low end. So this is a pretty drastic example. I don't know if I would add it in that much. I might drive it back to like here and then adjust the volume to the track. But adding in some of that low harmonic saturation can be a really good way to make sure that not only is your 808 hitting on a sub with the actual 808 as it was made, and then hitting on the top end with things like distortion, but you're kind of scooping out more of that entire range. So like, we'll take one more look where I do it on the clean bass. Once we engage this R bass, it really starts to take up a better region. Really here on that first kick, because if this R bass is not there, that first kick is pretty non-existent. And then we have this big, loud, lower end kick that comes in. So it's a little inconsistent on the low end right here. Adding in that R bass again just helps us kind of fill out some of those holes with something like an 808. An 808 is a super tonal, super precise pinpoint low end element, and sometimes you just need to broaden that up with something like R bass or max bass or voice of God or something really, really similar. All right, so far we've talked about picking the right 808. We've talked about EQing the 808 to clean up some of those mids to where it's not stepping on your whole mix. We've talked about adding saturation to kind of get some mid-range and some top end back in there so it's audible on low speakers. And then we've also talked about adding in some harmonic saturation in the low end to make sure that you're kind of scaling the entire low end spectrum rather than just these really pinpoint precise tonal notes that might change pretty drastically depending on the chord progression or the key that you're in. And the last thing that I want to talk about is a question that we get a ton, and that is sidechaining your 808s to a kick. It's not always necessary. It definitely creates a certain vibe in a lot of situations. Like when a lot of people think of sidechaining, they think of EDM where the kick and the bass are kind of ducking and swelling and kind of have movement. But it doesn't have to be that drastic. So I'm going to show you a couple different sidechaining techniques that I like to use to kind of create space if needed. But again, this is a taste thing. If you're finding that, you know, you're peaking your limiter a ton when the 808 and the kick hit at the same time, and it's kind of fucking up all of your extra, you know, headroom and all of your extra kind of balance, sidechaining that 808 might be a good way to make sure that you're not overloading that low end on things like compressors and limiters. So let's take a look at it. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to solo the drums in the 808 just so you can hear exactly what's happening. So we'll go over the most common technique, and that is adding a sidechain compressor. So the first thing you're going to do is add a compressor. I'm just going to use the stock one in Cubase, and then you're going to want to activate your sidechain. This is a little different in any DAW, but no matter what DAW you're in, you can look up how to sidechain an element and find a full tutorial on that. And then what we're going to do is we're going to add our sidechain source, and I want the kick to trigger the sidechain compressor for the bass. So when the kick hits, the bass ducks out. And that's how you have to figure out your routing. You have to put the compressor on the actual channel that you want to duck, and then you have to pick the send that you want to trigger that ducking. So I'll start pretty drastic and then we'll ease up. So let's go with like a release of like 80. Let's go with 100 so you can really understand what's happening. And then check this out. So for a song like this, if I was going to sidechain, I'd probably have it pretty fast, so it's really just skipping that low end of that kick. I'd probably have this at like, I don't know, let's try 45 milliseconds. And then what I would do is I would drive up this threshold and drive up this knee and ratio just a little bit. And what this allows you to do is this allows you to push that 808 a little bit higher in your mix. So let's say we go even a little bit more subtle with this, and let's get like maybe 3 to 5 dB of gain reduction. Now in the context of the whole mix, let me drive up this release so you can hear how that changes. So if you're wanting a super heavy sidechain duck, you're going to want more gain reduction, so drive that threshold down. If you're wanting that sidechain to feel a little bit more rhythmic and musical, you're going to want to time that release with that kick to kind of fit your vibe. But if you literally just want it to sit out of the way of that initial low-end transient of the kick, somewhere between like 50 and 80 milliseconds is probably going to be fine, and then somewhere with like maybe 3 to 6 dB of gain reduction right here is going to be more than enough just to get that 808 out of the way when that kick hits. And you can hear it just adds a little bit of movement, adds a little bit of breathing room, and especially as you start adding vocals, it's a nice way to make sure that you don't absolutely crush your headroom. So that's how to sidechain with a compressor. A big reason that I like using something like Serum for 808s or Anna 2 for 808s is because I can go through and instead of having to add sidechains and add routing and yada yada yada, I can just literally go into the patch that I've made or that I've picked, and I can adjust the attack, decay, sustain, and release just to kind of fit the timing. So instead of having to set up a sidechain, all I really have to do is adjust its attack up. And what I'd probably do is on something like this, I'd take a look at this envelope 2 and maybe shorten these up or even bypass them in general. And just by doing that, now I've got a completely different vibe. It's kind of not getting in the way of the kick, and then I can adjust things like the decay. So sidechaining or driving up your attack on your actual 808 preset can be a good way to get that out of the way of the kick. Another thing that I see done a lot is people will kind of duplicate their 808. So like, let's kind of reset this back to 0. So you could duplicate your 808, and then what you can do is you can split this with EQ. So let's say we're gonna try and cut off all of the top end of this A layer right here. So we'll go to like, I don't know, 200 is fine. Let's go even lower. Let's go to like 170, 162. So we'll call this Gnarly 808 low, and then we'll call this Gnarly 808 high. And then what I'll do is I will copy this Pro Q setting, but then I'll kind of invert it. So I'll paste it over here, and then what I'll do is I will swap this to a low cut. So now we have our top end, and we have our low end. And what people will do is they will only sidechain that low end. So the low end is getting out of the way of their headroom. So like this. But if they want the vibe that the kind of 808 is still there, especially with something like how this one is so gnarly, they'll make sure that their top end doesn't have that sidechain compression on it. So it's literally just the top end kind of sustaining with that kick, and then just the low end is being ducked. And that kind of gives you the best of both worlds, where that transient is hitting at the same time of the kick if that's a vital part to your arrangement. However, you're sidechaining that 808 low end to make sure that you're not building up that headroom and crushing a compressor or limiter. So you can either sidechain your 808 completely, you can go in and you can adjust your 808 if you're using something like a preset, or you can split your 808 and sidechain your low end and keep your top end completely fine as is. So those are just some of my traditional kind of mixing techniques for mixing 808s, or really any kind of bass throughout pop music. All right, and that pretty much does it. As you can see, there are tons of different methods and things that you can do for picking the right 808. Do you want something clean, distorted, kind of gnarly, something that's got some stereo width? And then once you pick the right 808, it's just dialing that in, getting the kind of lows and mid relation feeling right with some EQ, doing some harmonic saturation to kind of get some of that low end shifted around to feel a little better on your speakers. And then other than that, just getting some of that saturation to make sure that it's going to pop out on something like a phone or like AirPods or something that doesn't have a sub presence. So these are typically kind of my main go-to tools and tips and techniques. However, every song is different, so these are all just kind of starting points for you. But that's going to do it for this video. That's kind of most of the things that I like to do with my 808s. If you have any questions, let us know in the comments down below. If you want to like, comment, and subscribe, it helps us out a ton. And then if you want to support the channel, head over to makepopmusic.com where you can check out all of our stuff over there. But that's going to do it for this week. We'll be back next week with more content. And until then, much love, everyone. Peace.